Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. So I want to start with a reflection that I've been working on issues of violence and poverty for the last 5 years. And I still have more questions than answers. And I'm really eager to learn. And that's really the reason that I'm partnering with people like you who are doing amazing work on the ground. So really, my intention here is to present a very broad set of stylized facts that I observe in the world and that leave me with more questions than answers. So the purpose of this conference is to really start building some answers, at least that's for me. So the title of this is Violent Crime as a Global Development Challenge, and I really think that we need to begin to acknowledge this as one of the main global development challenges. And when I say violent crime, I'm not only meaning homicides. It's all the network of fear, extortion, and abuse of human rights in which many people in the developing world are trapped in. And there are two forms of violence. One is civil war violence that has received a lot of attention in the literature, at least in political science and economics. And these are dramatic increases in violence that normally last some years, but then life comes back to its normal state. But the violence we're talking about is a violence that bites society and takes hope away little by little. So it's the violence that really happens every day. Every time a person leaves their house and goes to school and finds someone who takes their life away, or who takes their livelihood away, or a police officer who abuses their rights, who hits them, or what is going on today in the United States and every single day in Mexico and Brazil, which are the two countries that I've been focusing on. So this is a very impressive map that Alberto helped me put together, which uses what is called the Global Burden of Disease data set, which is probably the best estimates that we have of how many people are dying in the world due to firearms. And as I say, this is only the things that we can measure, and that's the reason I'm focusing on deaths, but this is not the only manifestation of the problem. And what you really can see there, these are called the cartograms because it shows not only in red and orange and yellow where the most violent places are located, but also the magnitude of the problem, how many people are dying. And so you can see that Latin America is simply an outlier in the world, especially Brazil. And it looks such a big problem here, but also countries like Venezuela, which has experienced the most dramatic increases in violence. In that map, also Colombia and Central America. And Mexico is, now it's starting to look in that color as well. And what I really want to emphasize is the problem that we have in Latin America. That map really makes it very explicit. And when one thinks of violence, normally one thinks of Africa or even Asia. But really this map tells that there is something fundamentally wrong in Latin America that we really need to understand. So this is a figure that shows the relationship between development and violence. Okay, so on the horizontal axis, we have GDP per capita. And on the vertical axis, we have firearm deaths. So one of the puzzling and difficult or challenges that we face with development is that we face more violence at countries that are at the middle level of development. So Latin America, when we think of Latin America, we don't think of the poorest countries in the world anymore. So those are countries in Africa and some countries in Asia. Latin America, it's already in the middle range of development. And as you can see in that map, those countries that are at the middle range of development is where more violence concentrates. So that tells us something about the process of development, and hence the title of my talk, Violent Crime as a Global Development Challenge. So as the world is going to develop, so we can think of Latin America today and what Africa might become in 20 years. As the world urbanizes, without really institutions of inclusion and justice, this could be really the future of many countries in the world. And this is to me, a really important question that we need to face. What is really unique about Latin America? We really have no answers, and I think that's something that my work is really trying to understand. But what we really know about Latin America is that it's a very unequal region. It's one of the most unequal regions in the world, and this figure just shows the correlation between income inequality and violence. And it's starking. That correlation is starking. So there is something about social exclusion that breeds violence. And that's something that really need to reflect. And so when I think about this figure, and when I go to Rio de Janeiro, that I spent my last 3 years really traveling a lot there, and I go to Mexico, that inequality is just striking when you go to, when you walk in the streets and when you speak with people. So what is it about inequality that is breeding violence? And I don't think that we know the precise mechanisms. So some people say it's really about, obviously, social exclusion, but it's what that social exclusion creates in the minds of people. That could be one possibility, so that it just creates resentment and it breeds violence. Another possibility that I think it's more accurate is what the government does when it governs in a society that's so unequal. What I see in Rio and what I see in Mexico is that the government supplies public goods, supplies health, supplies good education to the rich, but not to the poor. And that is what, to me, is explaining those patterns. That when you have a society that is so divided, the attention of government is really given to the rich. So the good quality institutions are provided to some and not to others. And that's really a problem of governance. That's what I think is happening in Latin America. So let me just tell you what other things are happening. So my team at povgov here, Gustavo Robles and Alberto and Gaby Calderon, who is now in Mexico, have been working a lot on the issue of drug trafficking and violence in Mexico. And so I just want to show that the dramatic presence of violence in Latin America and in Mexico in particular is very closely linked to drug trafficking. That is a map of Mexico, and it shows that the red areas are those where you have more violence, and interestingly, they are places that are deeply connected to the transportation hub that brings drugs to the United States. So violence is deeply connected to drug trafficking organizations, and drug trafficking organizations really corrupt government. And that's what we're going to hear a lot about that today. Then I also want to bring some attention to the spatial dynamics of violence, and this is Rio de Janeiro. And we have spent the last 2 years geocoding homicides and also deaths caused by police action in the city. So we have a really interesting report about that, and I'm not going to talk in detail. But what I really want to highlight is the very high correlation between poverty and violence. So where violence concentrates in the city of Rio, and the red areas there so on your left side are the poor areas of the city, and the green areas are the rich areas of the city. And then there is, I don't think you can see that very clearly, but all the black dots are where homicides concentrate. So the correlation is really striking. There is very limited violence in the areas of the city that are green. And that's what I was talking about. In those areas, the public good provision, the action of the state has always been different than in the poor areas. I want to mention another important stylized fact that is going to come again and again in the talk today. This is gender and violence. And it shows the increases in violent deaths that have taken place in Mexico in the last 6 years. This area so it's 2004 to 2010, and these are males and those are females. So one of the striking aspects that we really need to consider is that that men, and young men in particular, this is also the age group, So you could see 15 years old, 20 years old. So the age group, the violence really affects males disproportionately. So that's another stylized fact that and it is not to say that violence against women is not really horrible, but it's just to say that who are being the main victims and perpetrators also of this violence. So this again is another stylized fact that I want to bring to your attention, and that I'm sure is going to come in our conversation today. And it's also related to what is going on in the United States today. And it's race and violence. So the murder rates here, this is for data of Rio de Janeiro, are just very different if you're a white person and if you're a black person. And this is, something people who come from Rio de Janeiro understand this data very clearly. And I think people who are in the United States also know this data very clear. But just when you see that dramatic difference between homicide rates for blacks, which is the red graph, and then for whites, it's just striking the difference. And then this brings me to Larry's comments about Baltimore today. So we have been, as I say, analyzing police violence. And the striking difference, again, that we also find here in the United States is how much police violence is targeted to blacks versus whites. And again, the red line it's black people in Rio. And I want to finalize by saying, okay, this is not only murders that we are talking about. And I began saying, okay, we tend to focus on homicides because we have measures of that, and that allows us to map areas that are really particularly difficult. And also, the tragedy of losing a human life is indisputable, but there is much more than that. So we collected a very large survey in Mexico, and we've done quite a bit of work on that, trying to understand what are the extortion patterns, both by the police and the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. So we went and applied what we call list experiments, that I'm not going to go in detail here, to go around the fear of people of saying, yes, I'm being extorted by drug traffickers. It's very hard to ask these questions on the ground. So we use this survey experimental technique, and we're able to find very striking presence of extortion by criminal organizations in Mexico. So the question that we are really trying to measure here is how many people in Mexico need to give money to drug traffickers so that they're left to survive, they are left to have their own business. It's very hard to measure, and we know it exists, but this is the results of our survey. So, we have here men, women, so the first, and that's the percentage of people who in the survey report that they are giving money to drug traffickers so that they are not harmed. So you could see a striking difference between man and woman. Look at the poor versus non-poor. Again, the poor are not only more victims of violence, but also more victims of extortion by drug trafficking organizations. And this is interesting, going to the issue of corruption. So we also have measures of where the PRI, which was the authoritarian party that was in power in Mexico for many years, and now it's in power again. And we find a very striking difference between more extortion in places where this party governs at the local level than where it doesn't. And then obviously urban and non-urban places. So there is significantly more presence of this criminal organization in urban places. So as I say, and I began my talk today, it's really about how many people, and especially among the poor, are living in these networks of violence, extortion, abuse of human rights. And this is, I think, that when I began saying I don't have the answers, I think that we don't have the answers of how to fix this. We know that we know what doesn't work. So Gustavo, Alberto, Gabriela, and I spent a lot of time working on trying to understand the interventions that the former president Felipe Calderón enacted in Mexico. And basically what he did is a war against the drug cartels. He put the army in the streets. There were 9 joint operations in which the army was sent to actually take over, basically, local law enforcement. And then they apprehended a lot of, this is a list of the drug kingpins that the government, the list was given by the government. This is actually a figure that the government released. It was published in The Economist. And then at the end of the administration, they had executed or they had put in prison all these individuals. And the result was this. This is 2007 when the administration began, and there was a massive explosion of violence. So we know that militarizing the streets is not an answer. At least I think we can now tell this very clearly. And the same thing has happened in Brazil. Actually, this is the work I've done in Rio, and it's really how policing was conceived as a military operation. And this mentality of warriors, it's really what inspires police violence. So we know this is not the approach. And what we really are, the goal of our conference today is really to understand some of the options that are really there and that we really need to understand more systematically. So one of them is, we are not going to talk about that. We had a conversation last year on the police. So the more work I do on this, the more I really think that the answer is how to humanize the police and how to humanize policing. And this is not a trivial task. This is not trivial. So there we are. These are pictures of some focus groups that Vanessa Verien and I did in Brazil, in Rio, with police officers of different battalions, and they were talking about their experiences of policing and their experience of what they conceive as being officers. And it's striking, and the difficulties of transforming this mentality of warrior, it's going to be really difficult, but without addressing the issue of how to change that mentality and how to humanize policing, I think we're not going to go very far. The second is really the topic of this conference is how you generate opportunity for the youth, specifically those located in places of violence. And this is the topic of the conversation today, and we really want to understand, with all the amazing work that you are doing on the ground, what is the methodology that works? What is it that makes some approaches work and some fail? And this is the most important, I think, the most important answers have to be about how you give these opportunities to what works on the ground. And the third point is really about corruption, and that's much beyond the topic of this conference. But without really working with government corruption and against government corruption, violence is never going to succeed. I think Carlos is going to talk about that and how that aspect is really killing Mexico today, really, literally. I mean, causing so much violence in Mexico and so much abuse of human rights. Lastly, and again, we're not going to talk about this, is, naturally there is so much profit in drug trafficking. There is so much that can be gained out of drug trafficking. And as long as the international drug regime remains as it is, it's going to be very hard for our societies just to cope with this violence. Because illegality and the regime that it just causes militarization of the police, and it also increases corruption, because there is so much to gain. So I'm going to leave that here, and I'm going to maybe some of these questions are going to come back during the conversation today. And so I want to give now Brenda opportunity to talk, and then Monica. Thank you.